Alright, YouTube, I thought I'd talk a little bit about enlightenment today. Sort of an abstract topic. Nobody really can prove a God exists or that spirituality truly exists or any of these other abstract things, so I chalk it up primarily to a person's own mentality. That is, that enlightenment is, technically, the ability to think for yourself. Now, some people eschew the idea of even enlightenment existing. They sort of just live their lifestyle in the physical world, and they say there's no real spirituality, there's no real purpose to any of these things which people teach. I've seen a lot of individuals on YouTube, some better, some worse, claiming that they have some sort of state of enlightenment. That's something that is up to each individual to determine that they have. Enlightenment being purely the independence of your thought processes. And I was watching a video last night by Acharya Sri Yogi. She's a Hindu guru. He claims to be an enlightened master. I find most of his views interesting. I think most of his views are spot on. Certainly more so than the other, self-proclaimed gurus on YouTube that you see, Life Bliss Foundation or any of these others that are constantly rambling about vegetarianism and so forth. I'd like to point out something, though. They're extrapolating their own religious views that they've always held to be a source of enlightenment. The Christians do the same thing. The Pope essentially claims an enlightened status, or a semi-deified status, through the teachings of the Catholic Church. Various Muslim authors and theologians and scholars claim sort of a semi-enlightened status. They use different terms for it, but they claim that they've got a knowledge, some sort of special, sometimes secret knowledge that they have that other people either do not have or have not yet achieved. And they claim that this differentiates themselves from the rest of the population. There are some who claim, for instance, that just meeting an enlightened master will in turn endow you with the beginnings, the sort of planted seedling of enlightenment in your own mind. True enlightenment, at its root, is the ability to think for yourself. I'd like to point out something interesting I've noticed. Throughout all of the so-called enlightened masters, whether it be, some Hindu guru or a Muslim, theologian and scholar, whether it be, the Pope, any of these characters, what do they all have in common? They all have in common, and it's either lip service that they pay to these individuals or an actual recognition of their work. They all laud the teachings of individuals like Jesus, like the Buddha. These individuals which they recognize as previously enlightened masters, and they essentially adapt those teachings. The problem is this. When they do this, they are acknowledging these individuals, Buddha, Jesus, whatever, as enlightened. What did those individuals do? They went against the contemporary grain of their lifestyle, and they thought for themselves. Jesus, and you can argue all day over whether Jesus existed or is an adaptation of a Zoroastrian myth. Let's assume Jesus existed for a moment. What did he do, assuming we take the Gospels at face value? He consistently taught against the priesthood. He consistently taught against the going laws of society. He was a cosmic rebel. He went against what other people already believed, putting himself up against society and against religious authority, saying, "You are wrong, repent," and then proceeded to trash the temple with all the capitalists in there that were, exchanging money for sacrifices. He turned everything topsy-turvy. He turned society on its head and said, no, the way you're doing it is actually the opposite of what you should be doing. You're racist, you're bigoted, you're, arbitrary laws everywhere. Just ignore them and live a good life. You see the same thing with a lot of individuals that these enlightened masters, so-called, these enlightened masters, they're looking back at the past, they're finding these individuals. The only thing they have in common is that they all rebelled against authority. Thus, even the enlightened masters, the gurus and the shaman and priests and so forth, these supposedly enlightened individuals, are lauding characters, and I would point out the entire Catholic priesthood, the entire Christian clergy, all look to Jesus Christ as their Savior. What they don't understand is that the saving message of all of these figures throughout time has been to do what you want but hurt nobody else. They are telling you to think for yourself. It's the sad fact that most of these individuals lived long ago. Their messages got transliterated, transmogrified into obey our specific church or you will burn forever. You must adhere to this specific dogma, most of which was laid down by other people. I would note, Jesus in the Bible lays down very few laws. Most of his laws are along the lines of love your neighbor as yourself, don't harm anybody, be a good person. It isn't until you look at the Acts of the Apostles or the letters of Paul or any of the other New Testament writings that you get a reiteration of the Old Testament laws, some of which are refuted, some of which are changed, and some of which are upheld. It isn't until you go into the extra Jesus content that you get this long list of different laws and these different things that they say which aren't even in keeping with the teachings of the actual Christ which they claim to worship. If they wanted to worship Jesus Christ, they would eschew most of what Paul wrote. They would remove most of the Acts of the Apostles. They would remove Revelation. They would ignore the Old Testament almost completely. And they would merely say to be a good person, to help others, and to not be an asshole. That is the true state of enlightenment. So here I am, a Satanist. I recognize Jesus as an enlightened individual, if indeed he did exist. Not because of his specific teachings, but because he thought for himself and rebelled against authority. Ironically, a satanic virtue, which is something people must understand, and something that the satanic community needs to understand. You can't just say, well, I hate God, I hate Jesus. If you actually read the Bible, Jesus was the biggest Satanist of his age, which is something people simply don't understand. They say, well, I hate the church. Well, yeah, the church is a corruption of the ultimately satanic doctrine of Jesus Christ. But getting off of Satanism, because it doesn't really matter what religion you belong to, if any religion at all. Everyone has the capacity to enlighten their mind merely by removing the old. It's like a computer. When you were born, your mind was a computer. It was more or less blank. It had some basic programs so it could survive. Over time, when you were growing up, your parents, your friends, your teachers, your society loaded a bunch of their own bullshit programming onto your computer. You have to wipe your hard drive. That's essential. And I'm not talking about some psychedelic ego death, although there are individuals who have used that to great effect. I'm talking about you need to understand. These things are subjective. They are not original programming. They weren't on your brain to begin with. You weren't born with a knowledge of a specific God. You weren't born with a moral knowledge. You weren't born knowing a specific language. These things are not technically necessary for your survival and reproduction. The key to enlightenment is not necessarily removing all of these things, because a language is a good thing. You can communicate with others. It's limiting. Unless you knew all the languages on earth, you'd limit yourself to communicating with certain individuals. Of course, having a moral basis, you can switch things around, and that improves it some. But some of the bases of morality, even within Christianity, are good. They help the survival of the species and so forth. Obviously, we don't go around killing everyone. The difference is, individuals which have become enlightened understand that these various teachings, these languages and so forth, are all subjective. They are not objective. What that means is that they were created by man. They are not inherently right or inherently wrong. They're simply convenient programs for your mind to use. It's in recognizing this and searching your own self out and removing that which does not make sense or does not work that you become enlightened. Enlightenment also has the aspect of knowing how to transform your mind, about knowing how to essentially reprogram your mind to think in any way you want. You can think in the abstract, you can think in logical terms. You can apply your thoughts to literally anything. There are individuals in this world who are truly enlightened individuals without even knowing it. They don't even have enough learning on the subject to understand what that would mean. There are individuals, particularly, I would say, that a lot of the so-called, ADHD children that never really liked authority, they grew up to be very intellectual, they grew up to be very enlightened individuals. They questioned the things around them, and they continue to question. They second-guess even their own preconceived notions. They second-guess everything that they learn. This isn't evidence that their mind is chaotic and wrong. This is evidence that their mind is capable of examining itself. The mind is technically a sensory illusion. It's a conglomerate of programs which we sense as being ourselves. When I look around me, I'm seeing things in certain spatial dimensions. I'm hearing myself or I'm hearing something else. I'm sensing the world around me. But that sense is an illusion based on how my sensory organs actually work. Based on how if I were deaf, I wouldn't hear anything. Does that mean that sound doesn't exist? Of course not. There are things we can't sense that exist. There are things that we sense that are purely abstract. The idea of a God, the idea of spirituality, these are abstract ideas. You can't apply logic to them and get any evidence for them. Doesn't mean that they don't exist. What I would argue, abstract ideas like good or bad, God, the devil, things like that, they don't literally exist. They're not physical, concrete things. They're not sensory. They're abstract. They were created by man for a specific moral or cultural purpose. The idea of, if you don't adhere to this doctrine, Satan will get you. Satan doesn't actually exist. The idea is you have somehow transgressed that religious and cultural moray, and thus you are a bad person. True enlightenment goes way beyond such concepts. So when I go on YouTube or anywhere else and I see, some Hindu guru or some Christian nun or priest talking about enlightenment, talking about the right way to heaven, the bad way goes to hell, this is correct and we know it because the Bible says so, we know through experience that X, Y, and Z, these aren't enlightened individuals. These are individuals that are taking the teachings of enlightened individuals and reapplying them. It's second-hand material at best. I would point out that unfortunately, the beliefs and teachings of many of the individuals that seem to have been enlightened, like Buddha or Jesus, unfortunately have been transformed so heavily, there's really no way to understand what they say. But there is that common kernel of wisdom. All enlightened individuals who have ever existed on this planet, because you cannot possibly not think for yourself and call yourself enlightened, have thought for themselves and been rebellious. They have rebelled against authority, they have rebelled against convention. This is the seed of enlightenment. I would point something else out. During the Dark Ages and the Renaissance, the Catholic Church used to burn anyone who took up a non-heliocentric view of the universe. The opposite of heliocentrism, I'm sorry. The idea that the Earth was the center of the universe, the sun going around the Earth. That was Catholic dogma. They understood what it said in the Bible. They said the Earth is the center of the universe. If you taught against that, you got burned at the stake or hung. We now know that the Catholic Church was wrong. How can we trust their translation of ancient dogma? How can we trust that these are enlightened individuals? They lived and died believing a lie. They lived and died honestly believing that their God had laid down the foundations of the earth in stone, that there were pillars supporting the sky, the constellations were literally drawn glowing figures. They didn't understand truth. And the modern Catholic Church is just a takeoff of the Catholic Church that made those mistakes. How can we trust the Hindus or any other group of individuals? We can't. They're not enlightened. They don't think for themselves. Both the adherents and the, dogmatic, the priests, the pastors, the nuns, the gurus, all these individuals, the people who make up these religious groups, are taking preconceived notions about ancient masters and reapplying them to the world today. They're not creating anything original. They're just espousing the same views that people thought up thousands of years ago in some cases. That's not a form of enlightenment. They're unquestioningly accepting the teachings of these people. So while you can say Jesus, let's just say Jesus is an enlightened master. Let's say Jesus existed, the Gospels are true, he was obviously enlightened, he was a cosmic rebel who thought for himself. Just because for Jesus those beliefs make him enlightened does not mean anyone else following the same prescribed dogma is themselves enlightened. Things change over time. Things do not remain the same in the universe. Certain physical laws seem to remain the same, at least for long periods of time. The Earth is in a different position now than when it was when I started this video. The universe is larger than when I started this video. How can you say that the subjective arbitrary laws that man defines aren't going to change over time as well? Religions change, languages change, they change every day. So, what you come to the conclusion of is that while there are people who have been enlightened for their time, their teachings aren't necessarily enlightened now. The key to enlightenment is to remove the old programming, which is basically your parents gave you your programming. They got it from their parents, and their parents got it from their parents, and so on back till the beginning of time. You're using million-year-old programs in your mind. It's when you realize this fact, and when you not necessarily remove them, but modify them as needed, that enlightenment begins. We could enlighten the entire human race through this process. It is possible to do that. Ironically, this forces me to take quite an optimistic view of human culture, because I believe that when the process begins that individuals become enlightened, it will spread. It will be seen as superior to the older doctrines. Therefore, evolutionarily, it has an advantage. It gives survivorship advantage to individuals and to itself. So it will spread until the entire globe becomes enlightened. We will be a godlike race, essentially. Not godlike in a theistic sense, but godlike in the sense we are ourselves. You must be an individual. You cannot follow someone else's prescribed doctrine and call yourself enlightened. So I refute all of these so-called enlightened masters, because while their teachings may be good, subjectively speaking, vegetarianism, it's good for the earth, it doesn't kill anything, it's good for the earth, it's healthy, it's safe, it's peaceful. Chanting mantras, well, if it makes you feel good, you're making yourself feel good, that's good as well. But you're doing these things because these other individuals are teaching them to you. They're giving you a dogmatic view. That is not enlightened. For you to follow anybody else on this planet and make them sort of your deity or your leader is the opposite of enlightenment. In an enlightened society, there would be no government. There would be no religious leaders. There would be no religion at all. There would be no need for these things. There would be no need to teach anyone any of these dogmas. Everyone would essentially hold one language, everyone would essentially hold one culture, and they wouldn't go around killing one another because everyone would agree. If you are being yourself, and you're not harming anyone else, of course, you're enlightened. You've become an enlightened individual. You have thought for yourself, but at the same time, you're not attempting to force others to think the way you do. So the opposite of enlightenment would be a group like the Catholic Church, like a Hindu guru, like some Buddhist monk who tells you the proper way to act for your funeral. Well, if you don't chant this mantra, you'll get lost in the afterlife and never reincarnate. This is the opposite of enlightenment. This isn't true enlightenment. True enlightenment is the ability to think for oneself and determine your own course of action without the need for other people to interfere in your thought process and say, well, I believe in God. I think I'll listen to this priest tell me about God. Well, what if the priest is wrong? Well, then I'll talk to a Hindu. Well, what if they're wrong? You see the problem here. You don't have any evidence that these paths are right. There's no evidence that they're wrong, but there's no reason to say that these paths are at least subjectively right. They're right for certain individuals at a certain time. For Jesus, Christianity, well, he was a Jew, but his teachings became Christianity. For Jesus, Christianity made sense. It doesn't necessarily make sense in whole or in parts and parcels in the modern age. So while Jesus could have been claimed an enlightened status back then, it doesn't necessarily carry over to the modern age. That's something people must understand.